Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Great Comms Connection. My name is Keela Flores, and I am a Senior Field Marketing Manager here at Haiilo, where we empower you to reach, engage, and understand your employees. If you're new to Haiilo, we are the leading employee comms, insights, and advocacy platform with a measurable business impact. We are proud to have more than 800 international customers trusting Haiilo to help them better reach, engage, and understand more than 2 million employees every day. I'll be moderating today's webinar, Trust as a Critical Building Block for Culture and Belonging. Some quick logistics to get us started. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Feel free to submit written questions anytime by using the Q&A option or in the chat. To kick us off, please go ahead and continue to let us know where you're joining us from. We'll also be sharing a recording of the session following the webinar. We're so excited to kick today's webinar off with Advita Patel and Priya Bates, authors of the new book, Building a Culture of Inclusivity, Effective Internal Comms for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And now I'd like to turn it over to themselves to introduce us and kick us off with the presentation.
That's great. Welcome, everyone. Do you want to introduce yourself first, Advita?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Sorry, I was just showing off the book because I have got my copy because it's been published early in the UK.
And I do not yet.
So I keep every opportunity, I keep teasing Priya with it, but here it is, and it is a bit surreal, but you can pre-order this book, which we'll tell you about later on in the presentation. But I'm Advita Patel. I own an employee experience and internal communications consultancy in Manchester in the UK. As you can see behind me, it's called Comms Rebel, and it's all about doing things differently in the world of work. And I'm also the co-founder with Priya on our second business called A Leader Like Me, where we work with individuals to help them build confidence in their career progression.
And I'm Priya Bates. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and I own Inner Strength Communication. And we focus on internal communication, employee engagement, and change management. And then, as Advita mentioned, we started A Leader Like Me in 2020 as a collaborative effort to step into the DEI space. And that journey has been really interesting. That has now culminated in a book launch that's going to happen soon. So today we're going to talk about trust as a critical building block for culture and belonging, because that's something that we learned, Advita, as we went through the book writing journey, that trust was so key.
Yeah, it's one of the main components, I would say, and we would both say actually, in building an inclusive culture. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to trust in our book, which we are going to be sharing with you exclusively after this webinar. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. But we're going to just talk through our thinking behind that chapter and hopefully share some tips and techniques and advice with you if you are currently going through building this inclusive culture in your organization.
Great. So we'll spend some time, in the conversation about trust. We'll go through the formal presentation, but we do, encourage you to ask questions. There will be time to ask questions. So please, participate. I always love watching the chatter. So if something hits you or something resonates on, talk to one another, because you're building relationships here as well.
Yeah.
So why don't we get started? So, one of the big questions is, why should we care about trust? And one of the key readings I have on my list as an internal communication professional every year is the Edelman Trust Barometer. I pay attention. I'm very excited to hear what are they saying about trust globally. And the results have been really fascinating. And that change over the last few years in terms of the loss of trust has been such a key factor in some of the challenges that we have as internal communication professionals and organizations and leaders. And so there were 4 key findings. One, first of all, the theme. They always come up with a theme every year. And the theme this year of the Edelman Trust Barometer was navigating a polarized world. And some of you may say, how does that impact our internal world? I think you all understand that we always say about the DEI space that it's personal and professional. And I think trust is that way too. And so we're really navigating all the stuff that's happening for our employees. We did that through COVID, and we're doing that through political discourse and all of these things that are happening, but we're navigating their real lives with their work lives. And that's never been more apparent than in our hybrid worlds right now. That mix of personal and professional and how that plays. So the 4 key findings that Edelman brought up was that our employees are faced with economic anxieties. They're worried about the economic collapse around the world. And that's creating a very much scarcity complex, this whole idea of us and them. Who do we trust? Why should we trust them? And it's been a key factor, even as internal communication professionals. What we've been, advising as consultants, we've been advising our clients is to really focus on what are your employees going through? What are they dealing with? The institutional imbalance, the one thing that happened, and we saw it slowly happening over the last few years, is that trust in business is one of the few institutions that are seen as competent and ethical. They don't trust government, they don't trust media, and they don't trust the big CEOs, the Elon Musks and the Zuckerbergs of the world, but they do trust their business leaders, the people that are closer to them. And that's an opportunity for us as internal comms professionals. There's this mass class divide. We're seeing the people in the top quartile of income, mostly our leaders, are in a very different place than the bottom quartile, our frontline workers in a lot of cases. And we need to manage that class divide because that is impacting the trust factor as well. And finally, there's this whole piece of the battle for the truth. We live in a world of alternative facts. We live in a world of echo chambers. So where we show up on social media feeds us information and connects us to people who think exactly like us. But that's not necessarily the case when we're communicating to our employees that are, are local, national or global. So what is the truth, and how do we drive that trust when we're sitting in echo chambers in our real lives, and in some cases our professional lives as well?
So what is trust and how do we build that? And we've used the trust equation in our book, and the trust equation, or the trustworthiness equation, has been created by Charles Green and his colleagues at the Trust Institute. And they've written several books about the trusted advisor, which I highly recommend you check out if you want to know a little bit more about this as well. But there's kind of 4 key things in building trust, which overlays the self-orientation. And I'll talk through each one of these so you understand what trustworthiness looks like on the personal level, as Priya mentioned at the start. So credibility. So credibility is, how believable are you? Are your words matching your actions? And there's a lot around credibility right now. And I've seen a few questions pop up in the chat function, which we'll cover off. But if you're not credible as an individual or as a leader, you will lose trust very quickly. And often we advise leaders on their credibility, because if your words are not matching your actions, people will disengage from you and they will not want to connect with you in any way. But credibility alone doesn't build trust. You need to be reliable. And this is about how much people can rely on you. So if you're saying that you're going to do something and you're going to do it by this point, then do it. And then do it by that point. If you can't do it, then be honest about why. If you're not going to be reliable and you're going to let people down on a regular basis, then again, you're going to reduce the trust they have in you. And some people, if you take it on a personal level, you may be one of those individuals that will say, oh, well, I'll meet you at 10 o'clock, and then you turn up at 10:15 and you do that time and time again. People will start assuming and making assumptions about you and not believe that you're going to be coming in at 10, or they might give you a slightly different time compared to everybody else. And that is eroding your trust as a friend, or as a colleague, or as a peer as well. Then you need to look at the kind of intimacy. So what I do want to say about credibility and being reliable actually is that it can be measured to an extent. People can look at that and say, oh, actually they have said what they were going to do and they have turned up when they said they were going to turn up. Intimacy is a little bit more challenging to measure. And this is about emotions, and this is about how safe people feel with you in terms of sharing information. So can people trust you enough to talk about some of the challenges that they may be facing, or some of the adversity that they may be going through in their organization, or some of the problems that might be happening in their personal life? Can they go over to, can they see that you're creating this safe space, and can they trust you enough to help them, or has that gone? And intimacy is an interesting one, because some people look at it as in a sense of, well, I don't want to like be a very open, I'm a very private person, and I don't want everybody to know everything about me. And it isn't about that. It's about, what are you doing to help people feel that they can trust you enough to share information, especially when it comes to building an inclusive culture, because that's a real critical equation, part of this world of trust equation. So just really think about your intimacy and what does that look like. And then overarching all of that, and underneath that, the divide, if you want to call it that, is self-orientation. So do you center yourself in some of the discussions that are taking place, or do you put others before you? And this is really important, because you may have the credibility, you may be reliable, and people do come and talk to you about various things, but are you doing it because it benefits you, or are you doing it because it benefits them? And be really cautious of this, because it can erode trust again if people think that you're only doing it for your benefit, for your gains, and you're only centering yourself in some of those discussions as well. So check out the trust equation. We'll talk a little bit more about it in our chapter, but if you want to know a deeper detail than the trusted equation book, it's definitely worth getting hold of.
So one of the things we talk about is, when we're advising and guiding leaders, we have a key role to play from an internal communication perspective. And one of the things that we need to do to build trust is listen. It's active listening. Yeah, I always say to internal communication professionals and peers that I mentor and train that listening is really important, because in some cases, we're the only ones who have that point of view from an employee perspective. So listening to people actively, not for what you want to say, but actually what they are saying, to understand where they stand. The channels that we own, especially if we've adopted some of the technologies, are providing incredible opportunity for listening and getting pulses of the employee sentiment. Observing, paying attention to what does it, and that paying attention is what you see, it's what you hear, but it's also what you feel. How comfortable do you feel the conversation is? I know one of the things I quite enjoyed when we were doing town halls or chats with our leaders, that I'd watch the employees, I'd watch their sentiment. I could notice when the atmosphere got heavy or when there was excitement in the air. And that's palpable. You could actually feel it in the rooms. And then actually actioning things, so that when you're listening, people see the results of that listening, makes a really big difference.
And the next element of this is learning. And it sounds, of course, learning is important, but it's true learning. It's doing those check-ins with those leaders on a frequent basis to try and understand what it is that's missing for them. Once you've listened to to the colleagues and individuals, and you listen to some of what's going on in the environment as well, because it's, to Priya's point, the observation is critical. And one of the best programs I ever did was a body language program, actually, because it really helped me understand and tune into people's little kind of things that they do, like the shuffle in the chair, or there's eye roll, or the head tilt, when certain leaders coming on. And that can be quite powerful, as well as the language and the words that you're using to work with leaders. So check in frequently and make sure that they understand what is happening across the organization, and feed into them some of the discussions that you've been having as well. Questions, curious questions. Ask them why they think that way, what has led them to that solution, why do they want to kind of promote this over that, what does that even mean? And we need to be quite curious, and more curious than we ever have been. And I say this because we're working in a world where it's fast paced. And I can imagine the many of you who are on this call today have a to-do list that's just never ending. And all we want to do is just get through it and get through it. But what I would always say to folks is that when you're trying to build trust, you have to be curious about that individual. And you've got to ask those curious questions from that leader to understand why they may have a certain idea or a position on a certain communications that they might be doing or messaging that they might be sending out. Analysis is really important as well, and looking at what the data is telling you. What is that engagement survey, the pulse checks, the absence, the performance, the retention, even, going as far as what stories people are looking at and saying around the organization, and just tracking it to understand what is happening. Have they read something externally that's ruffled feathers a little bit more that you need to kind of address in the right way? Are you advising leaders to be vulnerable enough to say that we don't have all the answers, but here we go, this is what we're doing? Because that will help to the final bullet, to build those connections that will allow your colleagues to come over and say, look, I've heard this, is it true? Rather than using other external platforms to share their thoughts or their worries because they don't quite trust what the organization and the leaders in the organization are telling them.
And then finally, lean in. From an executive perspective, this is the thing that we often hear internal communication professionals talk about for years, not having the seat at the table, not having access to the leaders. But we saw that change during COVID. And the key, I always said, after people started getting back to the new normal, if you will, was that we had to work really hard to keep that trust, keep that access. And part of that is leaning into some of those uncomfortable conversations, having influence. Influential skills are key in terms of impacting how leaders do things differently. So really focusing on being able to say things that they're not going to hear from others and give them the advice that they need, not necessarily what they want to hear. We don't do anything by being the yes people. We really need to have some of those difficult conversations and influence how they do things differently. Providing regular updates. One of the things we tend to deliver the stuff and then don't loop back and say, how did it go? What would we do differently? How do we actually drive things forward and create the progress that we're looking for? This is what worked and this is what didn't. As I mentioned, providing that really honest advice based on your expertise, based on your knowledge because you're listening, but also based on your expertise on what works and what doesn't. And then that measurement, Advita talked about the analysis, but really being able to support your advice with facts, with having the data. It makes such a big difference at the end of the day in order to build the trust.
A dashboard, when we talk about dashboards frequently, is a really powerful tool that you can have in your kit that you can share with your leaders in terms of what's happening across their department or the organization as a whole. And we say this because, in the moment, feedback is really powerful, but your opinion is good, but you need to back that up with evidence and data that leaders understand and want to know more about, because that's where you'll get their attention. So if you can link it into some actual measurable data that can demonstrate the impact that their trust is having across the organization, then they will listen to what you're saying. And we can't emphasize enough about measures. And both Priya and I are huge advocates of backing up some of your theory and your opinions with these kind of classic data points that you can keep track of. Because building an inclusive culture is not an overnight thing. It's a period of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It's a continuous loop. So it's important that you keep that in the front of mind for many of your leaders as well, where they're going and how they're getting there. So some of the IC trust pitfalls that we need to be aware of as communication professionals. Some of this will be really obvious and you do this on a daily basis, on a frequent basis, but some you may not be quite aware of, and you'll be surprised about the impact it can have in trust on us as professionals in the organization. So we've talked a little bit about building trust, leaders building their trust, and how that looks like across the organization. But just as importantly, how do we build trust in ourselves, so leaders trust us to deliver the messaging that we need to deliver? And some of these are some of the internal comms trust pitfalls that we've come across in our work that we've done with clients and in organizations that we supported. And the first one being the not having that opportunity to feedback. So what you may have experienced in some of the organizations that you support and work in is that when you're sharing a tough message, sometimes leaders may push back at you and say, actually, we're just going to share that message and we're just going to let it go. We don't have time to, have the debate about it or conversation. This is where you as the internal communications professionals need to have that difficult conversation, because if you don't allow people to share their annoyance or their worries or their anxiety in a very accessible and inclusive way, then you're setting it up for a fail, basically, and they will lose trust in you. And I'm not saying, if you work for an organization that has colleagues who are on the road quite a lot of the times and they don't have email addresses, yet the mechanism to feedback is through email only, then you may want to kind of reconsider how you might do that. And it's those little intricacies that you need to be aware of how are you asking for that feedback, and then what are you doing with that feedback, and how are you communicating it back to the organization, and how are you encouraging your leaders to take that feedback on board and talk about it, even if it is an uncomfortable conversation to have.
And the one thing that we always talk about, Advita, is when it comes to feedback, it's not just feedback after something's been launched, but a big part of change management is getting feedback from those folks that may be your resistors beforehand. Doing that stakeholder relationships, getting a feel for what is we communicating, and is it landing well before we get out there, because we're more likely for them to accept the message because they've been part of creating it. So whenever there's a large change initiative, it's a big opportunity to talk to them before you finalize things, and then they feel respected, right? The other one is inaccurate or incorrect messaging. We people are fact checking today, and the minute we've said something that is wrong and is incorrect, we lose trust very quickly. So it's that checking and double checking to make sure that you've got the facts, that it is supported, so that you can provide that information confidently to your employees.
Yeah. And just on that as well, and some folks may be using ChatGPT or the OpenAI source, which is a new way of working, and it's not going to go away. And you may be using that to kind of help you create some content or some information to kind of feed back into the organization. It's important that you do embrace some of these tools, but be aware that you do have to do your due diligence with them. Just don't take it for granted that what they are saying is factually correct, because it rarely is, because it's been the information has been built by human content, right? So humans are contribute to content, and often it can be biased, or it can be inaccurate, or it's not quite correct. So just be aware, if you are using those kind of tools, that you are doing your fact checking and due diligence as well, which then takes us into this irrelevant messaging, which is what it says on the tin. If you are sharing information, then be aware, why are you sharing it? What has it got to do with the work that you're doing in the organization? How is it contributing to the skills or to the work like the people are delivering? Like, is it because it's just one of the leaders is just shouting a bit louder than everybody else, and you want to kind of put it out there? Because if you put too many irrelevant messages out there, people are going to tune out. They're going to tune out, and they're not going to pay any attention. And we shared an example when we were in Florida a couple of weeks ago about an organization that was sending out a huge amount of awareness days and recognition day information without considering the impact, where some people are actually putting rules on anything that contained the word diversity, equity, or inclusion that went into a junk box. And this is what people will do if they feel that the messaging is not adding any value to their day-to-day work. So just be very conscious about some of the messages you're sending out there.
Yeah. And we're actively teaching people to ignore us. If 95% of the messages that come into your inbox from a specific leader or group are irrelevant to me, you're teaching me that I should not pay attention to 100%. And that's a source of frustration, but we really want to make sure that what we're providing is relevant to our employees. Limited representation, that when people don't see people like them, when you're seeing when our leaders, when our internal communication teams, when our HR teams do not look like the majority of employees, they do not look like the communities that they serve, that they don't look like the customers that they're trying to get attention to, there is a lack of trust. And we're seeing a little bit more of that the decision makers aren't necessarily making the right decisions because they're drawing on a limited amount of experience.
And then taking us into making assumptions. So when you don't have representation or you don't have access to fair representation, then sometimes you can end up making assumptions because of the biases, right? We all have whether they're not right or wrong, and we talk about bias in our book, but we end up making assumptions because we're working at pace. We want to get things done quickly, so we may not do the work that we need to do to make sure that it's true or reflective of what we're trying to communicate. So we'll make an assumption about a situation and communicate that, and it's not right. And that can take away trust as well, and erode the trustworthiness in some of the communication that we're sending out.
The next one is a lack of information. And this is not telling you to write the novel, because that's not what we do either. We want to provide the right amount of information, but when key pieces of that information are missing or perceived as being missing on purpose, too positioned, that can create a lack of trust. One of the terms I learned from a very strategic leader that I had was they used to use the term MISI, which means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. And essentially what that meant was every point stood on its own. So you didn't talk about too much, but you didn't provide too little either. So it's that just enough information to make sure people are informed is something that's a skill that you learn over time, but you want to ensure that key pieces of information that are relevant are not missing, especially if they're missing on purpose. That's something that you're going to be having to fix.
Yeah. And to track that, that's where measures would come in. So doing those spot check-ins with colleagues across the organization to see what they took away from that message that went out there, especially if you are doing some big change programs. You want to kind of keep checking in on different individuals to see what they took away and what behavior change has happened because of that information. If the behaviors haven't changed, then is it because the information isn't accurate? Is it because you've made assumptions, or is it because you're not shared enough? And you'll only really know that if you're doing your due diligence and checking in. And we're not saying do massive surveys or things like that, but it can be quite powerful doing those spot check-ins on different departments and different individuals, just to keep in tune with what's happening, especially in a hybrid world as well. That's really important. Coaching is a critical skill, I would say, in helping managers understand their communication methods and the way they communicate to their people and to their colleagues, because being a leader isn't about telling people what to do, it's about influencing them so they do it intentionally and do it with fulfillment as well. And sometimes some leaders will need that coaching for them to understand where their gaps are and where they may need to improve. And this is where your trust is important to build with that leader, because they will only really listen to you if they trust you, that they know that you've got their best interest at heart as well. So coaching skills can really help with that as well if you are struggling to form relationships with some of your leadership team.
The next piece is inconsistency. I always tie that manager communication to consistency, because when everyone in the organization has the same information and understands why, they're able to provide a consistent message out there. I know that Zane asked a question earlier about, how do we maintain trust when there's layoffs and economic pressures? But it's the inconsistency that creates the trust. I used to refer to myself as the reorganization queen at the organizations that I've.
Oh, Priya, I think your sound has gone.
I just pressed something, sorry. So I always said I was the reorganization queen, and reorganizations don't have to create distrust. what they need to hear is a consistent message. Reorgs shouldn't be surprises. They're hearing what's happening economically globally. They should be hearing information about what's working at the organization and what isn't. So when you're actually going through disruptions, when you're going through layoffs, it should be connected. There is a clean line that says the reason we're laying off is because of these reasons. And that's what creates the trust. So it's not that you trust an organization because it's not laying you off. Layoffs and reorgs, most of us are usually communicating them on an annual basis, I'd imagine, since you started your jobs, so they're not anything new. It's how you actually communicate why and what is happening and how you drive that consistency, and then how you explain that on the one hand, you're laying people off, on the other hand, you're communicating huge bonuses as a result of that layoff for executives. That's the disconnect that creates distrust. But if there is a clean line that is connecting those facts, it's really important.
And then, the classic case, which I'm sure you can all relate with, is that not having enough time to respond to information that's being shared. Like I said before, we're working at pace. There's lots of information that we're getting out to our colleagues. And not only are we contending with, our own information in organizations, but external information as well. There's a lot of noise out there right now, and more than ever before, people have got access to information themselves. So we are constantly sending stuff out all the time. But what we are not very good at, and I am generalizing here a lot, is that we don't give people time to absorb that information, especially when it comes to culture of inclusion and understanding some of the reasons why we are taking a different stand than we have been before, and why we may be changing the way we communicate with our inclusive language. All of that takes time. People have grown up with certain lived behaviors because of the environment or the society that they've grown up in, and the biases have been formed because of that. Just because they sit in a training session for 60 minutes with an EDI trainer, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change their opinions or their views. It takes a lot of time for people to adjust their way they work and unlearn some of the behaviors that they may have previously. So you've got to give people a little bit of time to understand what that information is and allow them time to respond as well, and have that very open, curious conversation with them, and encourage your leaders to give people time, because that's critical. I know this is rushed to kind of get things done, but I can tell you 9 out of 10 programs that are out there and initiated fail because you're not allowing people to give time for it to make impact that it needs to make in the organizations that you're supporting.
And it's something we've always said that, the difference between internal communications and external communications, or PR, is kind of the difference between the campaign versus the conversation. And the campaigns are those points in time where we throw stuff out there and say, rah, rah, here's what we're doing, here's what we've done. And then that's it. And you never look at it again. Whereas the conversation is, this is what we're doing. Let's get some feedback. How do you feel about this? It's really, whether it's on a micro level, on an individual basis, or from an organizational level, we can create that conversation that builds trust over time, because it's not just about the good times. The relationships we build during the good times actually help us during the tough times.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last piece is lack of action fatigue. We've heard, conversations about survey fatigue. People don't want to provide information because they're tired of surveys. It's the same thing as people don't provide feedback because they don't think you're listening or you're going to do anything about it. So we often say that, how we treat employees and how we act on the things that we're doing will actually build that relationship, that the silence is there because, or the noise is still there because they still care. It's the silence that worries me from an employee perspective. The minute employees or anyone stops talking to you, it means they don't care anymore. They don't think you're going to do anything about it. So really, really following up, again, part of that conversation is when you hear something and you've decided to change your direction, your tact, or your tactics because of that feedback, let people know about it. We spend too much time saying we're going to share the results of the engagement survey once a year, and then not talk about it again until the year after. We really need to say, here's what we did, here's what we couldn't do, here were our priorities. So really feeding back those little moments and those initiatives on a regular basis buys you a lot of points from employees versus trying to do everything all at once.
And the same applies to any awareness or recognition months that you may be communicating in your organization. So if you take part in Black History Month or Pride Month or International Women's Day, year on year you're recognizing these events and you're acknowledging them. But what are you actually doing for those underrepresented communities? Like, what has happened in the 12 months for women in your organization since the last time you had a group of women talking about their progression or talking about their journey, which is what we generally ask people to talk about on videos or on blogs. What has the organization done to change the way they work with women, or to increase the number of women at board level, or to help women progress further? Same with Black History Month, and same with Pride History Month and other recognition and awareness months that might be doing. Because if you just keep doing the campaign and not having those conversations, then you're not going to get the investment. So you'll get your staff network groups coming to you saying, communication are not doing their job because nobody turned up to my event and it's all your fault. Well, really, the question is, what changes have you made? Not the staff network group, really, it's the leaders. What changes have they made or sponsored to allow these staff network groups to do the jobs that they're meant to be doing, which is about recognizing that, and giving people a safe space to talk about some of the challenges that they might be facing so they can be fixed. And if you're not fixing them, and you just keep promoting them through posters and newsletters and blogs from leaders that are not meaningful, then people are going to tune away and they're going to feel disengaged and not feel included. So we have that responsibility as communication professionals to kind of hold the mirror up and say, can you tell us a little bit more about the story about what we've done in the last 12 months since the last time we did this acknowledgement for this particular awareness?
So with that, I know that we've got, look at that, Advita, we stayed to exactly 40 minutes.
Somebody would say we're professionals, Priya.
I know, exactly, exactly. But there are so many questions that we see coming up. I want to take the time to answer some of those questions and encourage all of you to ask your questions as well. So Zane, I'm hoping we answered your question on the, maintaining that level of trust during layoffs. It really is about a balanced messaging all year round, and not thinking that that layoffs and disruption are an opportunity to build trust and engagement. The next one I'll let you answer. Ash asks, so fascinating about people in echo chambers, we seek culture fit rather than culture add. That's an interesting comment. What do you think about that, Advita?
Yes, we do. So I'm just trying to find his question. So we see, we all seek culture fit than culture add. Yeah, because it's comfortable, Ash. It's really comfortable, isn't it, when you find people who have the same educational background as you, who may live in the same village as you, or came from the same university or college as you. It's a human reaction, and it's all from, the days of when our ancestors were fighting off saber-toothed tigers. We're conditioned to save our community, and if anybody who's a little bit different to us or looks different, then it's fight, flight, or freeze, right? And we're trained to fight and protect our community. And our brains haven't really evolved as much as the technology and the society around us. So when we see people who may be a little bit different to us, or talk differently from us, or look differently from us, there's a slight kind of hesitance in us, unconsciously or consciously in some cases, where we feel like we don't have that connection. So when you go for interviews or you're having conversations and you relate and you connect with people who are similar to you, you think, oh, they're going to fit in really well with the rest of the community, and they're not going to be too disruptive, and they're going to ask, they're going to align with some of our values and vision, which is true. They will do that, but you have to really be intentional and make sure that you are bringing people who are different to you into that discussion or interviews or conversation, so you can have a very valuable conversation about culture add, because culture add can be really powerful. And if you haven't read a book by an author called Matthew Said, it's called Rebel Ideas. It is an incredible book. He spoke at my conference last year, and it's because of him I created Unleash Your Inner Rebel conference. But he talks about echo chambers and information bubbles and some of the disastrous consequences that have happened because we have been stuck within our echo chambers and information bubbles and brought culture fit rather than culture add. So check out that book. And we quoted Matthew in our book as well.
And remember, it's culture add still means culture. Right. So we still have a set of values that we're evaluating against. There's still the strategy and the mission. So there are still some guardrails in terms of what we're trying to do, who we are, and where we want to go. But let's get some of the different experiences and different thinking in order to drive the innovation and the results that we're looking for. And that's what we mean by culture add. It's not just saying, let's bring people in who are completely different, who are unethical. Like I'm just throwing that out there. But,
no, it's true.
Right.
Yeah, it's true. People do think that. People think, oh, well, if they don't align with our values, then we can't have. It's not about that. It is about that. They still have to, it's to Priya's point. Yeah. Values and mission, and they have to understand the objectives of the organization. They have to understand what the organization's purpose is and how they're going to contribute to that organization and help them perform and deliver. But do they have to have gone to the same university, college, or do they have to have lived in the same town, or do they have to look like everybody else? Because that's where you need to kind of recognize the privileges in different individuals. And it's not only about race, it's about other characteristics as well, disability, sexuality, gender, age. All of that can make a big difference, and the assumptions that we sometimes have about some of these characteristics as well.
We've got a question from Shalini. In the context of trust equation and the 3 parts, would love to hear your thoughts about trust in a hybrid world, when we're not influencing face-to-face as much as we communicators used to. People's perception of influence trust is that it's more effective if done face-to-face rather than over an email, for example.
Yeah. And to be honest, Shalini, I would say you can definitely build trust in a hybrid world. You just have to be more intentional with it. You're missing the body language signals that you may have when you're face to face. You sometimes miss the context as well on screen of what you're trying to get across. So you have to be more intentional with hybrid world where you are connecting with people face to face, but it's not impossible. And I would probably say I disagree, controversially, that it's more effective than face-to-face. I think it can be just as effective on screen and in hybrid situations if you are just being a bit more intentional with your efforts. And, Priya and I were talking earlier about, Priya and I have only met 3 times face-to-face, 3 times. And we have, in those 3 years that we've only met face-to-face 3 times, we have written a book together, we've established a business, we've done some incredible things. And that's through the trust that we've built with each other. So it is possible. She's 5,000 miles away as well, in a completely different culture and community. And we have built incredible trust between the 2 of us through, being open, being vulnerable, asking curious questions, being honest. All of those play a big part in building trust in a hybrid world. You can't just expect people to trust you because of your job title or because you say that you should trust me. You need to show that through your actions, and you can do that just as well, I would say. What do you think, Priya? Do you think that's right?
And look at those trust pitfalls we talked about that are on the screen right now, that if we've got none of them require you to be in the same room. Yeah. So really think about that. Do you want me to take it off the share for for this part?
Yeah, I think
as we continue, probably maybe a good idea here. So we're bigger on the screen.
Oh, then I can see the questions properly.
Then you can see the questions. That's right.
There we go.
So what's the next question?
So Shalini, then we've got Natasha, who says MECE sounds similar to responsible transparency, defined as sharing all that is necessary and timely so people can lead effectively and meaningfully while protecting trust. Anything more or less creates doubt and hesitancy and limits performance.
I love that. That's really, really great. Yeah, so absolutely 100%.
Responsible transparency. Love that. Maybe in version 2 of our book, we might include that. Jane Reeves is saying that it's so refreshing to know that I'm not crazy. I just left an organization which pretty much did everything the opposite to how you are describing and didn't like me holding a mirror up to them. Yikes. Well, first of all, Jane, congratulations for taking that step of leaving, because we haven't really spoken about that. But if you are working in an organization where it isn't aligning with your trust values, then it is obviously it's a big ask, and not everyone is in that position to do so. But you may want to consider whether you can contribute your skills effectively in that organization, or whether you should just move on, because, life is temporary and we need to be certain that we can add value and contribute in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's nice to have, if you have that opportunity to be able to make that. I know that not everybody does.
Not everyone does
sometimes,
it, yeah.
right? And when we are really good at what we do, that's what we're seeing in terms of retention and recruitment efforts right now, especially with the demographic, the Gen Zs that are coming up, who we're hearing, and I actually am a mother to Gen Z, so when I listen to them talk about what they're looking for in a university, what they're looking for in an employer, they're so much more socially conscious right now. So I often say to organizations, because when I do audits with organizations, when we do the demographics, what we're seeing is a large number of, there's still some boomers there. There's a large number of Gen X who are getting ready for retirement, and they're large parts of organizations. And then we're seeing this push from Gen Z that's coming up. And Gen and Alpha that's coming up after them are just going to start entering the workforce in the front lines right now. So we're seeing this big shift that's happening. So I talk to a lot of organizations that I work with who are very legacy organizations and say, I know what matters now, but what you need to get ready for is what's coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's going to be, I think, a shock to our systems.
Yeah. Well,
after parenting them.
Yeah. Well, you are, as communication professionals and leaders, you're now communicating effectively with almost 5 generations in the workforce, and each generation is very different in terms of the way they may approach it. And I know some people don't believe in generational theory, but there is some truth in what is happening with the Gen Zs and the Alpha population specifically, and the millennial population is the middle. So they've got a foot into where they've been trained by Boomers and Gen Xs, and yet they understand, as future CEOs or current CEOs in some cases, they're going to have to adjust their style and trust with the Gen Zs and the Alphas if they want to retain talent and attract talent to their organization. Otherwise, they'll become obsolete and disappear, right? As many organizations have done so.
So Janet says, the time factor is crucial in my opinion. We're expecting our people to absorb so much information and handle so much in terms of change and new behaviors and unlearning old ways and learning new ones, all at the time when demand is at an all-time high and staffing gaps exist everywhere. Wow. And you're absolutely right. And most still haven't recovered from the trauma of the pandemic. There isn't any productive slack time anymore for the thought and reflection and discussion that's required to do truly great work or workplace culture. And there are companies, one of the things that was really exciting for us when we were writing the book is we were searching for examples of companies that seem to be doing this right. Nobody's perfect. One of our mantras is progress, not perfect. And we're actually seeing some bright lights start to appear. And it may not be that they're bright lights across the board, but there are moments that they're having where they're seeing the results. And that's what we want. We want to take a look at what is possible and what can we change. And then as communication professionals, I had a great conversation yesterday. I ran a roundtable for senior internal communication professionals. And what they were talking about is that the way they actually drove change was by saying no to the things that didn't matter. Remember, we talked about that irrelevant messaging, the noise that's out there. We actually need to help our leaders prioritize so that we can get through the noise. Right now, we're not doing any of us any favors by putting, communicating 20 commemorative and dates and cultural religious dates every day that just are the check the box exercises, and we're not doing anything about it. We're actually creating incredible amounts of noise. And then people say, well, DEI doesn't matter. Right? That it doesn't matter because it's just creating noise. We actually need to sit back and say what matters. what is important? What do employees want to hear? What is the type of information they need from us? And drive that conversation where we actually change the way we do things so that we actually help them focus and prioritize.
Yeah. And it's not, it's not easy work. Don't get us wrong. It's hard and it's difficult. And if it was easy, then we'd have loads of organizations doing this. But you have to take a step somewhere. Otherwise, you will burn out and you'll burn other people out. And it's impossible to recognize every single event and awareness and acknowledgement and dates. There's over 300 or 290 something. You can't do it. So you have to take priorities and you have to do more personalization rather than generalized and broadcasting. And that is something that you need to kind of think about when you're communicating and pushing back on some stuff. And which is why we talk about having a DEI strategy or an organizational strategy that has DEI in there in terms of what are the key priorities for this organization for the next 2 years. And then once you kind of fix that and understood that, then you move on to the next phase of it. But all of that does take a bit of time, and productive slack time is I understand that it doesn't exist, but only because we're putting too much, like to your point, on our people. So you have to pick and choose what is relevant in your organization in that moment in time.
I think we've answered all the questions that I went through in the chat. If you have anything else, I'm going to just bring up our last slide. So let's just
I think we just have one question in the Q&A by Emma, who says, can you recommend any training or resources to help IC pros to coach line managers? There's a myriad of training out there, Emma, and what we'll do is we'll share a list with Kyla in terms of understanding where you can, depending on where you're located as well. And I'm a qualified coach, and I'm always a bit cautious about some people who offer coach training who are not accredited or qualified. So we'll put a couple of bits and pieces together for you that you can do your research on. But there are a few people who are doing some good work in that space.
And some final thoughts, our book launches June 3rd in the UK, June 27th in North America. It's available for order at any place you order books. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Indigo chapters here in Canada. But if you go to the koganpage.com page, there is a discount code for those. And I know Keela is going to be sharing that information afterwards. But pay attention to us, connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter. That's probably where we're most active, and Instagram. Advita is a little bit more, Instagram real.
If you want to be absolutely inundated with my random reels, then please follow me on Instagram. That's where you'll see me.
And then what's coming out of the book is a series of keynotes and workshops that'll help us work with internal comms professionals and leaders and human resources teams on how we drive progress in this in the space from building a culture of inclusivity. And it's really, we've created some great, reflective exercises and workshops to help you. So we do a lot of consulting this space. Organizations come to us when they're kind of where they've created their plan, but they don't know how to get employees engaged in it. And that's the biggest frustration point that we're hearing from organizations, that we've done all the stuff, we've checked all the boxes, and we're seeing resistance. So that will, me in North America and Advita in UK, Europe, we're here to help, and we're bringing together a team that will help us help you as well around the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Priya and Advita, for joining us today. What a lively discussion. So much engagement too around this topic. So I really appreciate it. And as Priya had said, we will be forwarding all this great information for you to follow up on afterwards. So again, super appreciative of this meeting and all of your great discussion. Thanks so much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. See you soon,
everyone.
hopefully. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.